Okay, so good morning, everyone, and I'm happy to be back. I am hoping again this week I'm seeing Mr. Colin Peters there. I saw Mr. Joseph Roberts' name, and I think it was Leroy. Good morning, Mr. Colin Peters. Yes, so I'm hoping that at least you guys, if nobody else will chat with me, right? I always say I don't like to feel that I'm talking to the screen. So Mr. Colin Peters, Mr. Joseph Roberts, Mr. Leroy, yes, you're there, and I'm happy to be chatting with you guys this morning. So I'm just going to pull my presentation up so that we could start to take a look at this here. And let's just go into the slideshow view. Okay. Can we just go into the slideshow view? That is probably underneath there somewhere. Right. Yeah. Excellent. I'm jumping straight into it, and this. Oh, it's not shared as yet. Okay, so Nikolai is just helping me to get this. Make sure that we have the screen shared with you. Okay, excellent. And I simply entitled the presentation today, Change and Sports NGBs. Because we're going to be talking about change, but one of the participants here asked about change management. And the reason I didn't use that phrase on the slide is because sometimes I feel when we use these phrases, they sound so management or they sound so HR, and sometimes they could be a little bit scary because people feel, well, this change management thing must be something difficult or it must be something complex, and I don't really know anything about it. So first of all, I didn't want to use a phrase that would scare anybody away. And secondly, I wanted, even before we started to talk about change management, I wanted to talk a little bit about change itself. Because the thing is this, and I was happy to hear Lyndon talking about, what his business was like in 2003 and what it's like now. And the whole conversation about strategic planning is really about, and now I didn't catch his talk from the very start, but from my knowledge of strategic planning, what strategic planning really is about, it is helping us to get from where we are now to where we would like to be. And once we're having those kinds of conversations, we're really talking about change. Even some of the conversations that we had last week, how do we sort ourselves out in terms of the legal requirements, for example, of us. And then I would have gone on to do a session about policy and policy building. Once we're talking about doing something different in a business, once we're talking about improvement, we're talking about growth, we're talking about making ourselves a little bit more modern, then we are talking about change. So it's a conversation that we really do need to have. And I like that Lyndon also said that we have to have a change mentality. So that even before we get to where I'm going to be talking about change management, and I'm going to be doing that in a very practical, simple way, I want us to really talk about the whole business of change and for us to think about, how do we feel about change? Because unless we're really ready to grapple with change at a personal level, then it's going to be a little bit difficult for us to start to change the organizations we are associated with. Change starts really in our minds. Yeah. I was showing you this picture. It probably is going to take, yeah. Anybody seen this before or is familiar with this shot? It used to be a popular picture back in the day when I was younger. Yeah, before memes, right? Before the internet and before memes. But around 1990, or in fact, in 1990, this was a picture that engaged myself and some of my friends. It was a big thing for us because even before the coup occurred, something else was happening that was big in the world. And at that point in time, I was 18 and I was just on the verge of saying, but nothing exciting is happening in this world when I'm young. And then the Berlin Wall started to be dismantled. That wall that was separating the world almost east and west. And this is actually a shot of someone staring through or peering through the walls as they were being, well, the wall as it was being pulled down. Yeah. And I'm sharing another little shot here with you. What is this? You know, at first it might look like some kind of fancy medical high-tech kind of thing that's happening. Sometimes when I take my son he goes to a hospital in Miami, you know, this is how it kind of looks. But guess what? That's a little boy going to school. This is a little boy returning to school in China. And I just showed you those two shots because I really just want us to get ourselves into the headspace of change. Because change is all around us, big change, small change. And if you see the room that I'm in now, and everybody has their mask somewhere around them and everybody's sitting far away from each other, you know, many times change that we feel we can't do or change that we could never envisage can really become just a part of the normal way that we do things when we have to. Yeah. So today we're going to be talking about change. And very simple. I want to share with you what I would like us to cover in this session. It's a short session, but we want to talk about what is change. Because as NGBs, it is useless to talk about strategic planning. It is useless to talk about moving to a business mindset. It is useless to talk about new policies. It's useless to talk about social media and how we're going to do things differently if you're not understanding first and foremost that all of that is about change. So we're going to talk about change. We're going to talk about different types of change. We're also going to talk about some typical human reactions to change, emotional responses. I'm going to talk a little bit about resistance. Why is that important? Because many of us, when we start to hear about some of the things that we need to do, I have to re-register this NPO, or I really have to build policies. I didn't realize this is like a business. They want me to talk on policies now, or social media. I'm not really a Facebook person. Very quickly, when some of us begin to hear about the things that might be required for us to really make that step into the future, we start to get into I like to call it the world of but so and so, but I can't, but I don't like, but I don't know. But this don't make sense. The world of but. We start to move into the world of but very quickly when faced with change. And today I want to tell you that that's pretty normal. Yeah, but we have to find a way to get beyond that. If we really want to make our organizations future fit, I'll call it that, future fit. And there's a phrase I love to use, the future is now. Yeah, the future is now. So also we're going to talk about the importance of dealing with change. And I can say it simply here, but we're going to talk about it in a little bit more detail as we move on. If we don't deal with change, if we don't manage change, we're going to be left behind. Yeah. We're going to be talking about various techniques for dealing with change and uncertainty at a personal level. You, as the person who's in the NGB, to use a phrase that, is it Delreen? Is her name Delreen Liverpool would have used last week? You, as the controlling mind of your NGB, you have to first grapple with the whole business of change and uncertainty and find some techniques to help you deal with that. Then we're going to be talking about what's a planned change and what's required to make it happen. And this is where we get into the realm of what businesses typically would call change management. And we're going to talk about the importance of the leader in creating positive change. And I think if nothing else, I hope that you would pay attention to that part. Because if the leader of an organization, if the controlling mind of an organization is not in that change mindset, in other words, if you're not really ready to change the way you see things, the way you do things, if you're not going to be open to change, change simply is not going to happen. It's not going to take place. Yeah. So we're jumping straight in because I see Kevin was a little serious about the time there earlier when he was talking to Lyndon. So Not going to waste a second, okay? All right, so what's change? And all of us have dealt with change all throughout our lives. Can somebody just venture to tell me in your own words? Mr. Roberts, you're there. Good morning. I'm happy to see you. Tell me, what's changed? When you think about change, what's changed? Just in your own words, what's changed? Mhm. Yeah, I think Mr. Roberts said his mic is working. Mr. Roberts, if you want to speak, or anybody else, what's changed? Mhm.
I would say change is adapting to new circumstances through the adoption of new ways of doing things.
New ways of doing things. But Mr. Robert, I just want you to tell me the first part of what you said. After this, I'm moving on, so that's fine. What's the first part of that statement that you made, Mr. Roberts? Okay, change is about doing things differently. Mhm. Yeah, and I agree, it's about doing things differently. But I want you to think also 10 years ago in your own life, 20 years ago in your own life, 30 years ago, and my birthday is next week, Friday, so I've been thinking a lot about this whole business of change. I'll be 49 next year. And I remember when I was going to university and I was 18 and my mother was 38. And my friends and I used to chuckle about her sometimes because we thought, 38 is really old, as over the hill. I'll never get there. And now next week I'll be 49. And the point I'm making is this: change is not just about doing things differently. Whenever we talk about growth, whenever we talk about development, whenever we talk about improvement, we are talking about change. I want you to keep something else in mind. There's a phrase that's used for all of you who've had little kids at some point, or if you still have little kids: growing pains. Growth, development, improvement, change, they don't come without their own pain. So that all of this conversation, all of the dialogue that's taking place as part of this workshop, intended to really help the NGBs to grow, develop, move forward. We don't expect that growth and development and improvement and change is going to happen seamlessly and without some amount of grappling and struggling and pain. That's the way things work. So change, we know what it means. It has to do with being different in some way. Yeah, being different in some way. And I like to say it a little bit differently. It's the same thing I just said, but I like to say it a little bit differently. We can never grow or develop or improve unless we are prepared to change. You can't change and stay the same at the same time. Yeah. You can't grow and stay the same. The two things don't happen together. So in order to be prepared to grow, develop, change, you have to be prepared to deal with those pains. Yeah. You have to be prepared to deal with the struggles to get to that new place. And I have just put into a nutshell the whole business of strategic planning. That new place that you want to be, that's the desired future state. Yeah. So that's what change is about. And that's what this entire workshop is about. It is about creating change for you. There are different types of change, of course, evolutionary change. And some of your NGBs have been changing in a very evolutionary manner over time. Evolutionary change is slow. It happens with us too. Sometimes you might meet somebody, you say, how have you been? I haven't seen you for 5 years. They say, well, nothing big has changed, nothing much, But guess what? Every day we're changing in many different ways. Sometimes we think we don't look different at all until you pull out a photograph from 20 years ago and you could barely believe that that was you. So evolutionary change is change that's taking place all along by bit. Revolutionary change is big change. And some of the changes in terms of how we operate when we are out in public now, that's revolutionary. We weren't wearing masks this time last year. That would have started later on last year. Plan change. And hopefully some of the NGBs represented here today will be sitting down and thinking through some plan change. Change isn't always planned. Change is many times unplanned. Something happens, and that's what I was trying to get Mr. Roberts to talk a little bit about. Sometimes situations occur, and those situations push you to have to do things differently. But sometimes you don't have to wait for the situation around you to change. You can see what's happening elsewhere, and you can plan a change for yourself. There's also structural change, which has to do with how your organizations are set up. There's strategic change. I'm planning out a change because I'm strategizing and I want to make something happen. I want to win. I tell everybody that phrase strategy was first used in conversations about war. People at war were people who strategize when we watch those old movies. Yeah, because everybody who goes to war wants to win. So we have to sit down and think it through. Nobody goes to war and say, well, we'll wait until we're on the battlefield and we'll see how it goes then, or whatever happens. People don't think that way. In war, we have to sit down and strategize because we want to win. And from the military and from war, the next place where the world would have seen the word strategy and strategic be used became the world of business. But here what? You won't find organizations who are not faced with a certain thing we're going to talk about. So let's just say if you're the only bank in the country, you're going to be strategizing a lot less. Or I always say, if you go to the passport office and you're not happy with the service, it doesn't really make that much sense to storm out and make a big scene, because I don't think you could go somewhere else and get the passport. And the word I'm going to talk about is competition. Strategy became a big thing in business when competition started to really increase. Now, you might be saying, but I'm an NGB and I represent a particular group of players or other associations, and I don't really have to compete with anybody. But that's a kind of narrow perspective on competition. Because sometimes when we think, well, we don't have anybody to compete with, so we can do whatever we want, or we can operate the way we want. But you could end up kind of dying a natural death because you could become very irrelevant in the world. Yeah. So strategy, or really sitting down and thinking out, planning out, I hate to use the word plotting, but almost plotting to make sure that you get what you want for your organization. That's also a big part of charting change for your organization. Of course, when we talk about change, you can have change in people, meaning that you could change out the people in your organization. And I was hearing at the launch of this workshop that it's very typical that in NGBs and NPOs in general, that the heads or the persons in charge tend to change very quickly. And of course, we could change processes. So those are just types of change, and I wanted to talk about that. How do humans react to change? And I love this phrase. I feel it captures it all. All changes, even the most longed for, have their melancholy, their sadness. For what we leave behind us is a part of ourselves. We must die to one life before we can enter another. I'm going to read it again. All changes, even the most longed for, have their melancholy. For what we leave behind us is a part of ourselves. We must die to one life before we can enter another. And I think it really captures that whole business of how do humans feel in change situations. And sometimes I know I do this kind of training, and in some environments, people say, well, all this kind of stuff about change, people feel about change. And so what's that have to do with business? Business is about money. Yeah. But guess what? Unless we put ourselves in a mind frame of we need to change, we must change, I can change, then what we're going to find happening is our businesses can soon die. I love to talk about this story. I say it all the time. And of course, I'm paraphrasing this story, but there's a story that goes like this. Now, when I was a child, when you heard someone's going to take a picture, you heard about cameras, there was a word that was synonymous with cameras, Kodak. Right? A camera was a Kodak and a Kodak was a camera. And I mean, you could just kind of say Kodak and yeah, Polaroid as well. But the story with Kodak is this. There was a point in time when somebody walked into the boardroom at Kodak, some little upstart, and says to the board of directors, have you ever thought about the idea of going digital? Maybe we would want to do digital. And the board of directors, the group of men, of course, very traditional because we're most likely talking about older white males, very traditional in their thinking. The story goes that you could have picked them up off of the ground laughing. Because in their minds, who would want a digital camera? Well, guess what? It turns out everybody. And at one point, Kodak had to file for bankruptcy. They had to close it up because you see that idea that seemed to be the craziest idea in the world. What about digital? Kodak, which was a giant in business, says, why are you talking, in my words, why are you talking that kind of nonsense? But you see, when we don't get ourselves in a continuous mind frame, in a place where we understand that we have to find a way to roll with the punches in this life, we have to keep our eyes open, our ears open, and figure out what needs to be done, we can soon find ourselves becoming very irrelevant. Yeah. So I know that I'm talking to NGBs, and right now you're probably thinking about how does this whole concept of competition even affect me? But I want you, when you think about competition, to also think in terms of relevance. I would have mentioned last day that I'm very involved with Blind Welfare Association, which is a non-governmental organization, and it's also not primarily set up to make profit. And it's a question that we've been asking ourselves recently. We don't have a serious competitor. Why do we need to strategize or do things differently? Well, one of the reasons is that if we don't start to do things differently, young persons who are blind or visually impaired growing up may simply say, well, I don't want to be part of that association. I don't need you. I have computers, I have voiceover, I have, everything at my disposal. Why do I need to be part of an association? So as the NGBs move forward, I hope that you're thinking in terms of your own relevance and also understand that arrangements that exist today may not necessarily be the arrangements that have to apply as we move in the future. Yeah. Just another simple quote to really encapsulate what we're talking about. Any change, even a change for the better, is always accompanied by drawbacks and discomforts. So we're asking you to make positive change in your NGBs. We're not asking you to do something that won't be for the good of everyone. But we understand, and we want you to understand that we know that change always has its growing pains. So we're saying that to you. I'm introducing you to this diagram. It's called the change cycle. Introducing you to it very quickly. It's just a little something to give you an insight into how humans typically tend to react when faced with change. And there are a whole range of emotions that people experience. People feel anxiety, happiness, denial, fear. Yeah, anxiety. I really have to go and set up all those policies now in this NGB. Yeah. Or we really have all this legal work to do. We didn't go and re-register. What about the fines? What about the money? They talked about deadlines. A strategic plan social media now, they're talking about Facebook. What are all of these things that I have to do? They get me scared here. Let me bust out from this NGB. Yes, this is too much. Some people may even feel anger and hostility when faced with change. And now this diagram that I'm showing you here, which talks about emotions, it has to do with any change that you might be experiencing. But some people, when change hits them, they're angry, they're hostile. Some people feel guilt. Some people even get depressed when faced with too much change. Then you can get to the point, and if you are healthy in your responses to change, even if change upsets you at first, or even if you have a what might be considered to be a negative emotion. I'm using the term very hesitantly because there's no negative emotion. We just have different emotions. But even if you are faced with things like denial and fear and anxiety and so on, at first, when change hits you, or when you see change coming your way, if you have a healthy response to change, after a while, you start to get a sense of, hey, maybe this change is not so bad. Maybe there's something positive in here for us. Maybe I could move ahead. Maybe this is really a new beginning, a whole new chapter. I can see how this is going to be good. Yeah. And the whole business of us understanding change and coming to terms with change is really to help ourselves whenever we have to deal with change, which is every day, which is going to be your life. If you haven't had a massive change hit you yet, it's going to come. That's life. The whole business of understanding change is so that we help ourselves to get to that point a little bit faster, where we can understand that when change happens, we can find a way to create a new beginning for ourselves, even in the face of what seems to be so much not what we had hoped for, what we had expected, or what we never thought we would have to be dealing with. Yeah. So why is dealing with change important? Change is part of life. It's the only constant. I mean, we hear that it's become such a cliche, but it is real. And sometimes I feel we need to, when we hear the cliche, not just think of it in a very cliched way or just say it, but we need to really let it internalize. Change is the only constant. It is part of life. Things are going to happen. We are going to have to grow. We are going to have to do things differently. We are going to have to make some changes. Change is also part of personal mastery. And in my little conversation at this point here, I know that the persons who are in our virtual space, sharing the virtual space with us right now, you would be some of the controlling minds of the NGBs. In order to manage change in your organization, because this is what SportTT is really asking you to consider, or SportTT is asking you to do. It's saying here, come join us. We're holding your hand because we want to help you make some change. But unless each individual who represents an NGB is prepared to really grapple with change in your own mind, then it's going to be hard for you to lead change in an organization. So how you manage change and how you deal with change has to do with your own, what we call personal mastery. It's a fancy phrase, but all it means is really how you manage yourself. And if someone is in control of themselves and manages themselves, then we say that they have personal mastery. And part of that has to do with dealing with change. Dealing with change is also very important because it helps us to deal with the stress that comes from change. And most of our stresses have to do with change. When we're in a place that we're really accustomed to, what people like to call our comfort zone is comfortable because there's no change involved. Yeah. So change always brings about a little bit of stress. And I'm certain last week, I know I ended off my session by saying I was hoping that everybody was not going to sleep peacefully that night, but everybody was going to be rolling around, tossing around, thinking about all the things that we had thrown out to you. I wanted you to have a kind of acceptable level of stress, thinking about the things that you have to do. But hopefully, all of the things that seem to be, coming onto your plate at this point, we don't want them to cause you stress to the point where you will be stressed out. But we need for you to manage the stress so that the change occurs. Because all of these things that we are inviting you to do, they need to happen. Change is also important because dealing with change at an individual level is a prerequisite for you leading change. And that goes back to all the same conversation. And back to Lyndon this morning, Lyndon is talking about strategic planning and really pushing your entire organization into the future. Somebody needs to lead that change. An entire organization moving into a future that is different from the one that it exists in right now is not going to happen just so. It's not just going to happen by chance. It's going to require some person, and it might be you, to get to the front and say that I will be the person to march forward, you know, and to take us forward into the future. I like to always use this analogy. Back in the day in school, and when you have sports day, well, that's the only time I used to be involved in any sports. Sorry to say I'm in sport TT, and I'm ashamed to say that. But back in the day in school, and you have a little sports day and so on, you have march past, and they talk about what's the one where you stand still? Mark time. And what I want to say to you is that you can never mark time and go somewhere at the same time. Leadership is about taking your organization, taking your NGB somewhere where it hasn't been before. And now I'm starting to sound kind of Star Trekky here, right? Going where no man has ever gone before. But going somewhere, leading people somewhere, can never be the same as marking time. Marking time is standing in the same spot. Yeah. So all of this change that we're really talking about, it's tied up with the whole business of leadership of your NGB, and it really has to do with whether or not it's going to happen. And I don't know if Justin and Kevin have thought about it like this, but whether all of this change that you are hoping for in your NGBs, whether it will happen, really has to do with whether some one person in each of those NGBs will sit down and consider what is really required and take up the mantle and push forward. It's really a leadership game, So what are some techniques for dealing with change and uncertainty? Before we get into that you're going to be planning change and how do you do that? Understand that change is constant. We said that before. Acknowledge that change can be positive. So everything that we're saying here to you is it's not onerous, it's not burdensome. You can do it. Recognize that all humans have emotional responses to change situations. So if you feel a little bit overwhelmed at any point when we're talking about change or doing something in a new way, that's pretty normal. Spend time understanding the things that you do have control over and the things that you cannot control. So when we're talking about your NGBs and pushing forward, it's about sitting down at first and really trying to sort out in your mind, where are we? Where are we? What are some of the things that we do have control over? What are some of the things that we can change by, a few simple moves? What are some of the things that we need to put some more attention and effort into doing? And at a very personal level, I like to tell people, we can practice. Lyndon talked about a mentality of change or change mentality. We could practice developing a change mentality simply by asking ourselves every single day, do something new. Push yourself to do something new. Challenge yourself to do something new. Something that you think that you can't do. Something that you feel you don't want to do. Something you don't like. Yeah. And start to practice yourself in this whole business of becoming a little bit more friendly with change. Yeah. And of course, managing your stress is always at it's a kind of underpinning of the whole business of managing change. Some tips: keep your eyes and ears open at all times. As an NGB, what's happening around you? And the thing is, you don't even have to keep your eyes and ears open at all times by yourself. You have Sport TT. You have the ministry. They're kind of tuning in to the rest of the world for you, even if you haven't been tuning in yourselves. Sharpen the saw. And sharpen the saw, I didn't make up the phrase. It's a phrase that's borrowed from Covey. Covey is the guy who I'm sure you've heard about the 7 habits of highly effective people. And one of the things Covey always says is you have to sharpen the saw. You see, many times when we are faced with change, the whole business of change, you have to change. We need for you to change. Unless you change, you're not going to make it into the future. We're very scared. And one of the reasons is because we're not sure we have the skills. or we're not sure that we're prepared. We're not sure that we can do it. Yeah. Sharpen the saw is simply saying to every single person, whatever skills you have, you keep them sharp. You keep yourself sharp. And whatever change is thrown at you, you're going to be able to manage. The sharper you keep yourself and your skills, the better you're going to feel in terms of your preparedness to move forward. Yeah. But we can't expect to be thinking 1980 and 1990, behaving 1980 and 1990, and 2022, not even 2021, 2022 problems almost ready to hit us in the face. Yeah. So we have to keep those skills sharp. And as NGBs, what exactly is our skill? In my own NGB that I'm sitting in here right now, all of you in that virtual space, what's my skill? You're not the actual player per se, but what's your skill? What is it that you're doing? What is it that you're offering? And how skillful are you at offering whatever is the thing that you offer? Have you been keeping those skills sharp? Have you been learning new skills? Have you been thinking about offering new things? So I guess I'm really asking you to think about who you are as an NGB. And that's critical if you're going to be thinking about where you'd like to be and where you'd like to go and who you'd like to be in the future. Who are you now? Also recognize that some things do not change, such as the need for positive attitude and building and maintaining healthy work relationships. I like to say that my attitude is an I can attitude. I can. It's not a but, it's not a I can't, it's an I can attitude. And that's what we're going to need to develop, thank you, sweetie, if we have to move into the future. Making planned change happen. Now, what's planned change? Planned change is not a hurricane came and blew down your building. That's unplanned change. Planned change is where you've sat down and said, hey, there's some things we're going to do around here. There's some policies I want to put in place. Or there's some things, some changes I want to make to our leadership, or we're going to get together to make some changes to our leadership. We're going to be doing things differently. We're going to present ourselves differently. Of course, I'm seeing a comment, Mr. Pierre, Leroy Pierre, that change is constant. You're asking, is it necessary to follow change of one country when cultural type of one change may not work in one environment? Yeah, well, the thing is, when we're talking about change, so I'm going to go back almost to the start. There are different kinds of change. Sometimes change hits you. Change hits you and you have to respond. Yeah. Sometimes we feel that change hit us. It didn't really hit us because all the signs were there, but we didn't want to see the signs. We're all behaving in this country like COVID hit us. March 13th, they sent on children from school and we had to start to wear masks and change. But guys, we were all reading about COVID on the internet, at least for a couple of weeks. But you know what? We live in Trinidad and COVID's not going to come here. Yeah? COVID's not going to come here and we don't really get sick and nobody dies here because we're all Trinidadians. God is a Trinidadian too. So that's not going to happen here. So sometimes what we even describe as change that's not planned, we didn't know it was coming, it happens to us. Sometimes it's not even really that. If we're keeping our eyes and ears open enough, you're going to see some signs. There are always signs around us, right? But even as a country changes, even as we attempt to change, and last week I would have talked about, when we talked about policies, that sometimes in our organizations, we can even be ahead of our country in terms of how we think. Change always has to be in keeping with what's going to work for us and what's appropriate for us. And of course, we have to think about the environment. So Lyndon spoke about strategic planning just now. And when we talk about strategic planning, it's really about where am I now? If I don't change anything, where will I end up? But where do I really want to be? And then how am I going to bridge that gap between where I could end up if I don't do anything differently and where I would really like to be? That's what strategic planning is all about. But that picture that in my mind that I develop about my future, which is what we'll call a vision, I have to, of course, create that vision, keeping in mind the environment, keeping in mind the environment, keeping in mind the reality of everything around me, and of course, also not being bogged down by the reality and the environment. So I want it seems as I'm saying as if I'm saying two contradictory things, but I'm not. I'm saying that we have to be mindful of environments and work with our environments and make change that's appropriate for us. But I'm saying that sometimes when you think outside of the box and not feel that the environment is boxing us in, sometimes you can make a change that is completely, you know, different to anything that anybody would have ever thought about before. And if you sometimes think about the environment too much, then that innovation could get completely locked off or blocked off. I'm saying that, and just to make this little point before I move on, you know, sometimes when we are not boxed in by ideas about what can work in an environment and what could not, and I'm of course I'm not talking about doing anything that's illegal or outside of the legislative framework, but sometimes when we're boxed in by how do we do things here, how do we do things in this culture, how do we do things in this country, how do we do things in this industry, we can really be just that, boxed in. There's an interesting gentleman, if you want to YouTube this after, by the name of De Bono, very unassuming guy, unassuming looking guy. And he's a thinker who's known for the six hats kind of thinking. When you have a problem, think about it from six different perspectives. But he was a guy who came up with something that's very important today in an industry that I was part of not too long ago, which is the oil industry. So he's having a very casual conversation with somebody about drilling, and usually to drill oil they go down, yeah, go down. And he's having a very casual conversation because that's not really the field he's from, so he's not boxed in by the environment. And they're probably talking about problems or something like that, and they usually drill and they go down. And he says, "Well, why not go across?" And there began the thing that's now called horizontal drilling. And it's big. But it just came from this guy saying, well, you've been going down, why not go across? So I'm saying that sometimes, yes, we do have to think about change and change that we want for ourselves as appropriate in our context, in terms of our organizations, our culture, our country, but don't be boxed in by it. Yeah? So someone's asking a question here about a strategic plan. Who are the parties to be involved in putting this plan together? And the answer is, of course, I have a favorite answer, but it's not that I'm escapist, but my favorite answer is it depends. Yeah. If you have a very big organization, you would want to get as many persons as possible involved in a strategic plan. And I don't mean that you're going to have hundreds of people come together to write the actual document. But a strategic plan starts off with, it's really very simple. A strategic plan is all about creating a vision for yourself. Where do I want to be in the future? And that vision, that mental picture of where do we want to be is where it all begins. Because then after that, I ask myself, well, if I'm going the way I'm going, am I going to end up there? So let's say, we want to make a certain amount of money. We want to make $100,000 every month. I'm just giving an example. Right now, we're making $5,000 and our behaviors are chasing away customers. If we continue the way we're going, we're not going to end up there. And the strategic plan is about working backwards now that I've created a mental picture of where I'd like to be, working backwards to figure out what are all the things that we need to do to make that happen. If you have a big organization, then you want to get as many people together in the room from the point of where we're even thinking about where do we want to be in the future, helping to create that vision. If it's a smaller organization, of course, you want the minds to be involved. But part of change in organizations, generally speaking, as we move forward, and at this point in the life of this world as we know it, organizations are embracing more and more a participatory approach to doing everything. The more we can get more people on board, whether it is to say, where would we like to be in the future, or the more we get more people on board to discuss, how do you think this can happen? How do you think we can make this happen? That's where we're kind of headed. That's another change in organizations. Long ago, organizations were run by the person at the top. The leader said, this is what we're going to do. And then no dog bark after that. You have to do what the leader said. Organizations have moved ahead largely from that, because the thinking is that the people who work for an organization and the people who work with each other in a team, I'm saying it different ways, they're not just hands and feet, they're also minds. So while you may have a controlling mind, to use the phrase that Delreen said last week that I love so much, you have a number of other minds in organizations, and you want to get them involved and participating in deciding where that future is going to be. For an NGB, if you're thinking about a strategic plan, I would even venture to say that you move outside of yourself and even get to the stage where you are involving clients, stakeholders, who we might have otherwise called customers. The persons you serve should have some small hand to play in deciding what the future is going to be. You see, sometimes speaking to these people who may not be directly involved in the running of your organization, they can give us valuable insights into what you can do to help your own organization stay relevant and alive. Another famous example I like to talk about all the time is the typewriter. You know, you don't want to be an organization that is getting everything right in terms of how we do things, but you're creating really good typewriters in a world where nobody wants one. You know, and in a world where most of our kids have never seen one, and I mean, we're in a world where kids have never even seen a rotary phone, right? So reaching out to persons who appear to be outside of your core group of controlling minds could be a very good idea when you're attempting to develop that idea of where do we want to be in the future, because what do we want to do and who do we want to serve, and what are some of the things that we need to be able to do that, what are some of the skills we would require, because we might want to do it a little bit differently from how we've been doing it now. Yeah. So I'm talking about a plan change now. In your organization, you've decided that you're going to put some changes in place. You're going to do some things differently. Understand that it's about goal setting, and goals are always about change. Once you have some sort of goal, we want to develop some policies, or we're going to change your leadership, or we're going to be reaching out to our clients in a different way, then you're talking about change. Be part of a positive change, understand that change can be positive, and if you are actually shaping the change, make it positive. And recognize that people only embrace change when there is something in it for them. What's in it for me? Why would I want to change? How is it going to benefit me? So what I would say to you as an NGB, or as individuals who represent NGBs, when you're thinking through how are we going to grow, improve, develop these organizations, think about change that will benefit you and put those changes in place. How will the change benefit me? How will it benefit all of the other stakeholders involved in this NGB? Because there must be a benefit in it. Even the things that you feel you might be mandated to do only. There may be some legal requirements, for example, and well, I have to do it. But even when you are told that you have to do something, it's because there's some good reason behind it. And you have to sit down and try to understand that before you could really push forward. I'm just sharing a little phrase with you here. Everyone thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing himself. And I think that's one of the reasons why I wanted to really tackle the whole business of change by first talking about change and the individual before I got into the fancy change management. Because the NGBs, and I'm going back to make the point, and now I'm kind of looking around in the room to all of these TT persons, the NGBs are not going to make the changes that may be good for them at an organizational level unless you have one or two persons in there who really are prepared to make that change, that mental shift on a personal level. It has to happen first because somebody has to take up that mantle and say, I'm going to lead this change. If that doesn't happen, what's going to happen is quite a bit of talk. And 2 or 3 years are going to pass and you'll realize that nothing has changed. So organizations have to make that decision for themselves. Am I prepared to make the change? If I'm not, maybe I need to, you know, get out of the way. Yeah, I can't sing the rest of the song, but right, get out of the way, right? Um, and maybe I should let somebody else make the change that's required to move into the future. So organizations need to think about that kind of thing for themselves, because I can't change the world unless I'm, prepared to change myself. And maybe in this NGB, there are things that we need to do in order to get with this new future that's required of me. The entire world is changing. Yeah. You must be the change you wish to see in the world. And that's Gandhi, and that's a very popular phrase. You must be the change you wish to see in this world. What do we want to see in terms of sport? And I was so I really enjoyed being at the launch and hearing the Honorable Minister talk about everything that she spoke about in terms of sport. Because everything that she spoke about in terms of sport, it resonated with me in some conversations I was having in other sectors. But how do you really make this shift? We are where we are now. Sport is a sector, and then Vashti Guardian from TTCSI says, but we want it to become an industry. Sport must become a money earning, and not just, Lyndon said it, in developed countries, sports earns big time. It's not just little, it's not a pittance, as my grandmother used to say. Yeah. But how can we get to that place? Especially because we might talk about sport as though it's one big entity, but in reality, it isn't an entity that is some kind of homogeneous monster that is walking around with one brain. Sport is made up of all of these little groups and agencies and bodies and every single player. So the change that we want to see for sport, it means it now has to happen with every one of those little groups. And it has to start with some individual somewhere. So you must be the change you wish to see in the world. So for you NGBs, what's the change that you wish to see? And if it's aligned to what Sport TT is asking or suggesting must happen, then it's about making a whole mental shift. Managing change is important. And now I'm talking plan change in an organization. If you don't manage it properly, the change is not going to stick. And what I mean by that is, you might think, all right, we're going to do things differently from today, but unless you manage your change, you're going to go back to doing things the old way. Managing change is important for the success of your project, and of course, making sure everybody stays sane in the organization as you change. I have put onto this slide that's going to show up just now here for you. This is putting everything about change management into a nutshell. It is everything. If you went to do a course on change management that was a year long, 2 years long, a week long, 1 day long, this is what it is about. If you have to make a change in your organization, then you need to manage that change and manage the way you go about doing it. And effective change management requires you to do 5 main things. You need to do 5 main things in order to effectively manage change. And this is extremely relevant to you, because anything that you want to do, improve, grow in your NGB is a change. Yeah. The first thing that you need to do in order to really help yourself effectively manage change or do change management is to motivate change. And what do we mean by that? To motivate change simply means that you have to get your people understanding why this change must happen. You have to get your people understanding either one out of 2 things. Hey, if we change, this is how we could benefit. Yeah, so we really want to move in that direction because we could benefit from changing. Or you have to get your people to understand, if we don't change, this is what could happen to us. If we don't change, this is how we could be negatively impacted. Yeah. Part of that is also being able to explain to the people involved in your organization how external forces, Mr. Roberts talked about the environment, how external forces may be pushing you or pressing you to change. So we have to. Our stakeholders are really requiring us to change. Or yeah, all the money that's changed over time. I'm seeing that up there. So change happens all the times, and I've heard many people say, and this is the other thing, when we think about how change affects people and how change benefits people, I've heard so many people who want to hold on to those old bills say, you know, "Oh, why did I have to change it? Nothing was wrong with the money." But I'll tell you one great reason that, I'm happy that it's changed. Pardon? Yes, exactly. Because I have a child who's blind and I can now show him for the first time what's the difference between $100 bill and a $50 bill. Before that, if we continued the way we were going, when he started school or grew older, he's going to have to either find a way to put his money in some kind of order in his wallet. And what if he makes a mistake? He would have had to depend on the goodness of strangers and ask, you could tell me if there's $100 bill or a $20 bill. Why would I want that? So that change has brought such a wonderful benefit to at least some groups. That's not irrelevant to what we're talking about now, because I want to talk about the fact that when you are thinking through change for your organization, and when you are trying to understand what change you need to make and also convince your people, hey, we need to do this, you need to think broadly about all of the groups who form part of your stakeholder group, because going back to the money example, if we never think about the blind and visually impaired, then we don't care about if the money works for anybody. But we have to think about all of the groups of persons who we serve, and how can we find ways to change in a positive direction to help all people, all groups. Yeah. So just going back, we're talking about effective change management. We're talking about what are the things that we could do to help organizations manage their change effectively. The first thing I'm saying is, you're inside of an organization, you want to make change, you have to be able to share with people why we need to do this. If we do this, this is how we're going to benefit. If we don't do this, hey, this is how we're going to suffer. Also, people are pushing us from the outside. Sometimes it's about people are not pushing us from the outside yet, but hear what that is coming. So let us be a little bit proactive. Let us not wait for when we start to get pushed from the outside. We need to change. Organizations need to create a vision. And this ties in nicely with what Lyndon would have been talking about before. If you have to change in an organization, you have to sit down and really start by creating that mental picture of the future. What do I see ourselves as doing here in the next 5 years? What will we be doing? How will we be serving people? How will we be operating? That's your vision. It's not only so that you could then work backwards and make things happen, but it's also this. When there's a vision, it has to be a shared vision. And when your NGB has a shared vision, hey, we're working towards this picture we have of how we're going to be operating by 2025. When you have that shared vision, when times become tough and you're struggling because life is hard. Now I'm sounding like Jordan Patterson, because it's hard, right? Life is hard, right? And you're struggling, that mental picture is going to be the thing that is going to steady you and hold all of those persons who work with you, hold them firm, because we know what we're working towards. People are also going to be able to see all how the little things that they do contribute to that bigger picture. And that's why a vision is so very critical. So what's the vision that you have for your NGB? Tonight, when you're not going to sleep, as soon as you get to your bed, that's what you should be thinking about first of all. What's the vision I have? What's the vision I have for the NGB? And that's a big change. In other words, what's the changed future that I want for this organization? And then after you sit down and start to thrash out, how am I going to get there? You have to develop some political support. And by political support, I'm not talking PNM and UNC. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about you have to find a way, if you have to make a change happen in your organization, to get persons of influence, sometimes within the organization, so it might be within your NGB or outside of your NGB, to get them on board. And going back to the question that was asked, when someone asked before, how many people, well, to this effect, how many people should be involved in the whole business of strategic planning? Long ago in business, and by long ago, I mean like 2 or 3 years ago, right? Long ago in business, we like to use this phrase, buy-in. We need to get buy-in. We must have buy-in when we're doing something. But in business now, we're not talking buy-in anymore, because buy-in is if I have an idea and I've come to Justin and I'm saying, Justin, do you like it? Let me try to convince you that this is good. I want you to buy into my idea. But in business now, people are talking co-creation. We're saying, Justin, if you're going to be part of this whole thing that I'm working on, if you're working with me, why don't you sit with me when I'm at the stage of even mapping out the vision and help me to create it? It's not that I'm coming to you after and saying you like it. That's buying. But we're more getting people involved who are important to us at the point where we're now developing ideas, so that we all come together to say, this is the future that we need. That's one of the ways to make that political support happen at an even earlier stage in the game, where we get the important players, the persons with influence, involved, not at the point where we're selling them something we've already made, but where we're getting them involved at the point where we're saying, hey, I need your ideas. Because you see, people always like that, mama guy, people like that kind of thing. You value my ideas? Oh, I'd love to be part of this now. Yeah, right. So you've convinced the persons in your organization that we need to change. You have a vision that's set up and everybody knows what it is, and we're working towards that thing. I've gotten all the important people on board by either having them buy in, or they were part of actually creating this vision of what we want to be. And now we actually have to make the change. We have to manage the transition. And there's all kinds of different thinking about how that should happen. At some point, you guys, I'm seeing an interesting comment. Somebody from Sportity will talk about that after. Yeah. There's all kinds of interesting conversation about when a change has to be made. Should we make sure everybody's bought into the idea? Should we make sure everybody's involved and then make the change? And some of the literature says now, hey, when a change needs to be made, just make it and people will fall in line, which is kind of like you've made a whole turn around in thinking. But to change, we must. And it's about managing the transition, understanding and giving understanding and being understanding, but also keeping in mind what it is we want to achieve. And what happens many times in organizations, when we have grand plans about how we need to change or big things we need to do, we get to the point of where we make the change happen, but we don't stick with it. We don't sustain the momentum. We don't, keep the energy going. So sometimes we have great plans, lofty ideas, and then they fall away after a while. So change management is really about those 5 things: motivating change, making people have the desire to change. That's another way to say it. Creating a vision, having people be aware of what it is we're working towards, developing political support, making sure we have all of the important players support us so that we better have the ability to continue with our change, managing the transition, making the change, sticking with it, providing the support to those who are working with us on our team, and sustaining the momentum. Keeping that vision, waving it around in people's faces, that's one of the ways to sustain momentum. People quickly forget why we are making a change or why we're doing something different. That's why that vision is extremely critical. Yeah. So, Kevin, I would have gone just a little bit over time, but if there are any questions or comments, we could take them now. I know there's at least one comment that maybe Sport TT wants to respond to, or maybe not. Um, yeah. So what we talked about today is change. We're talking about the fact that change is something that individuals must grapple with. Individuals can practice themselves in becoming, as I said, better friends with change, even before it happens, because change, it is going to happen. It's going to come around, and every day we're dealing with small changes. The better we are in dealing with small changes, everyday changes, when the big changes come, you know, we're going to find ways to be a little bit more resilient, pick ourselves up off of the ground, and work with the new world. So I also made the point that in order to lead an organization, we have to understand that leading is always about change, because leading is going somewhere different, is moving somewhere, doing something different, doing something improved, and you can't mark time and move at the same time. You can never do that. Marking time is, and people can mark time very well in organizations. And sometimes if we want to separate off just managing and leadership, that's how we separate it off, because I can tick off boxes every day. They told me to do A, B, C, D. I tick it off. I did that A, B, C, D. But that's marking time. Leadership is when we start to say, we've been doing A, B, C, D, but we could start to improve A, but we could also be moving to an F. And you see that B that we're doing, there's a whole new way of thinking about that. That's leadership. So this entire workshop really is about leadership in your NGBs, and it's about asking your NGBs to move forward into the future. All of that is dependent upon someone in there being able to say, I'm going to be that person who's going to stop marking time, move forward, understand that I have to embrace change. I have to embrace change personally first, and then be able to lead change for my organization. So thank you very much.